And are there any questions on the agenda or overall process for today before we get started and I turn it over to Mark? Hearing none. Okay. So with that, Mark, do you want me to run the slides?
Yeah, I think I'll try to share my screen if I can, Jason.
Yeah, if you want to share your screen and run your slides, that'd be great. And just want to, appreciate Mark Gaines from Avon for providing this presentation today. And Mark, if you want to hold questions for the end or however you want to do it, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Can you hear me all right now?
I can hear you loud and clear.
And can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I'm having a little trouble getting it to unshare, but we'll go from there. So appreciate everyone's time this morning. My name is Mark Gaines. I'm with the Avon transmission planning team. So Avon covers both NYSEG and RG&E. You might be wondering why transmission planning is starting off of this meeting to cover distribution planning issues, and then that's really the topic that we're going to be discussing is how the lines between transmission and distribution is blurring, and specifically the way Avon classifies our medium voltage system, where some utilities classify as transmission, some classify as distribution, will kind of, I think, become obvious as we get into this discussion, why I'm leading this conversation. So we're going to be discussing some constraints that we're seeing on our medium voltage transmission system, how we're trying to handle it on Avon Grid, and trying to hopefully start the discussion on what other utilities are seeing, so that we can maybe work together on a unified approach. Okay, so just one last second to confirm that you can see my slides as they transition. Sometimes I know they can't freeze. Are you seeing the second slide now?
Yep, all set, Mark.
Okay, fantastic. I won't ask that for every slide. I just, with the first transition, I want to make sure. So what we're going to cover today is, adding some background or context to what we're discussing, make sure everyone's level set and on the same page. When we talk about constraints, what does that mean? Where are we seeing them? That kind of high level summary. Then we'll go into a little bit of details without getting into the technical weeds, just adding some context, some numbers to how severe the problems that we're seeing are, and hopefully using that to further guide the discussion. We'll switch over to the process, talking about maybe gaps is a strong word to use, but areas where the current processes that we have are maybe being used in ways that maybe weren't intended for, and some struggles that are associated with that. And then we'll cover a little bit of what Avon is trying to do to help mitigate these gaps and to try to provide the best support we can for our customers from a reliability perspective, and then also our customers who are trying to interconnect as generator owners. So that's a little bit of an overview. And what I'll do is I'll pause at the end of each slide to go over questions. There is only a couple of slides with a good amount of content on them, so I will ask to hold questions until the end of each slide, but we'll go from there. Any questions at this point before I get further going? Okay, fantastic. So what are we talking about when we say that we're seeing system constraints? Well, there's mainly two types. There's high voltage constraints, which we classify as being greater than 1.05 per unit. I think that's pretty consistent between utilities, although there might be some differences in slight variations there. And then we're seeing thermal overloads as well. So for normal conditions, that obviously means that the normal rating of the line or the equipment is being exceeded. And then for contingency conditions, when we're studying those, that means that the long-term emergency rating of the equipment is being exceeded. And where we're seeing these constraints is kind of discussed below. So you're seeing this, essentially it's one line that's broken down into three sections, and I'm going to revisit this on a future slide. And so the terminology that I'm using here between local transmission system, sub-transmission system, and distribution system, I do acknowledge is Avon Grid specific. Specifically when we talk about the sub-transmission network, which I have shown here as being between 46 kV and 34 kV. I understand that the other utilities have different voltage ranges. Some utilities consider this to be part of the distribution system. And so I don't want to say that this is the right way to do it or this is how it should be. I'm just trying to level set by saying this is the terminology that that we use at Avon Grid. And so for this presentation, that's the terminology that I'm going to be using. I'll try as much as possible to be voltage specific instead of saying transmission or distribution, but this is a little bit how we break down the network. So we have the local transmission system, which is the 115 kV and above, where we're not seeing too many issues. Then we've got what we call the subtransmission network, or the medium voltage transmission network, which is below 115 kV. Most of our network is actually the 34.5 kV network with some 46 kV. The constraints that we're going to be talking today are actually exclusively occurring on the 34.5 kV network. However, we're expecting that to change in the near future, where we do expect to see these constraints occur on the 46 kV network as well. And then we've got what we consider distribution network, which would be usually in the 13 to 4 kV range. We do have some distribution that's 34.5 kV, so there's a little bit of overlap there, but we can discuss that as it's applicable. And so obviously, when we're talking about the constraints that we're seeing, it's constraints that are due to distributed generation, or generation that's connected to the distribution system, either on the 4 kV to 13 kV networks, and then back feeding up onto what we're calling the 34.5 kV network, the subtransmission or medium voltage transmission networks. Yeah, so like I said, and so where we're seeing that, kind of the last comment there on the bottom, is that while there is a large variation in voltage levels, where we are seeing our constraints right now, it's limited to the 34.5 kV. We're not seeing these constraints roll back up to the 115 kV and above system yet. We do anticipate we're heading in that direction, but we're not quite to the point where we're seeing that yet. So are there any questions at this point before I move on into some more details? If there are hands raised, I don't know if I can see them, but sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I'm just on phone, so I can't raise my hand. But this is Brandon Smithwood at Dimension Renewable Energy. Thank you for doing this. On the line exceedances, could you just give a little more like color there of, like, is that an -0 situation, N-1, N-1, I mean, like, how
Sure.
Is this about low voltage, or low load days that the line's being exceeded? What's the just trying to get an understanding of what that metric means.
Sure, absolutely. So when we talk about thermal overloads, it can be both system normal conditions, or it can be N-1 contingency conditions. For our 34.5 to 46 kV network, we don't study N-1, or we don't study more extreme or lower probability contingencies like internal breaker faults or things like that. We limit the contingencies that we study to things like lineouts or transformer outages, kind of the more probable contingencies that we would expect to see on that system. And so the thermal overloads that I'm noting as a constraint can be either overloads under system normal conditions, or can be overloads under N-1 conditions. And then the voltage constraints that we're seeing, we do study the system when we're proposing this when we're studying distributed generation. We do study a daytime light load case, which is obviously supposed to reflect the lowest amount of load we would expect to see during the daytime. And that is where we are seeing these system voltages occur. In some cases, the high voltages are extreme enough where, as we increase load to, moving away from daytime light load to being more kind of like your typical summer day, or in some even extreme cases, even like a relatively high load or even peak load case, we do still sometimes see high system voltages. However, the most limiting case in essentially all conditions for voltages is going to be the daytime light load case. Does that answer your question?
That does, and I just ask because, obviously we're running, as an industry, we're running into the similar problems in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, and, Maine often, and it's the same kind of, deal, but another Avon grid utility, 34 kV subtransmission lines where there are thermal overloads, and then, CMP's consultant, has gone and kind of done what they call challenge sessions, and maybe you've been scooped into these because I think Avon Grid's been helping out a lot. But they go through, and it's like, well, actually, this is just an N-1 scenario, and we can just curtail your project in the instance where we have a planned outage and something happens. So I'm always kind of wondering what the magnitude is, because a relatively modest amount of curtailment is obviously a lot cheaper than reconductoring miles of 34 kV line. So I'm probably getting too into the weeds, but that's just what is animating my question.
No, that's a very good point. And I don't think it's too into weeds at all. I will talk a little bit about curtailment on a future slide. And so I'll get back into that discussion. As for CMP specifically, what they're doing up in Maine, I can't speak too clearly to that because I haven't been directly involved with that. But if you do have specific questions or concerns about that, I can get a point of contact for you. We could probably more easily answer those questions for you.
Oh yeah,
right.
No need. I know those folks well. Just saying. I think it's very analogous, at least in terms of the high level, situation.
Sure. All right. Are there any other questions on this slide before I move to the next one?
I think Kat had her hand up, and I have my hand up. I don't know, Kat, did you?
Yes. Yeah, I did. Thank you. Thanks, Mark, for this. Just again, another kind of clarifying question in terms of background and context, which is how and when does Avon Grid identify these constraints? Is it through, individual generator studies, or is it through area studies? And then the second is approximately when did you start seeing this happen? Just again, for context and background. Thank you.
Sure. So to answer the first part of that question is through the Caesar process. When we study individual generators, in the base case that we use, we model all the generators that are ahead of the project that's being studied in the Caesar queue. We have a queue spreadsheet that we go through for that. And so that's when these cases are getting identified, is by just the Caesar study process that we have. We don't have an explicit like cluster study type process, although I will talk a little bit more about that, as it's something maybe I don't want to jump into the word cluster study because there are a lot of connotations associated with that, but there are more detailed studies that we occasionally do, which I'll get to on a future slide. And then your second question, I believe, was how long we've been seeing these constraints. I would say the first couple of constraints were identified maybe 2.5 to 2.5 years ago. And what we were seeing was it was really just one or two locations that was very specific to the topology in that area, where those constraints seemed to be very much limited just based off of that specific location. And then we really didn't start to see it spread until probably about the last year or so, is where we've really started to see more and more locations pop up, where we started to realize that this is becoming more of a system-wide issue. That's when we started doing a lot better job of tracking where these constraints were when they were occurring up, and started to do some data gathering and trying to get the conversation started about what type of options we can provide these developers to help facilitate getting their projects interconnected, but also to maintain our system reliability. Does that answer either or hopefully both of your questions?
It answered mine. Thank you so much, Mark.
Mark, Bill Acker from New York Best, and thanks for doing this. I think I've got a pretty good understanding and feel for the high voltage faults, but I really appreciate a little bit more clarity on what you're actually seeing for the thermal overload faults. And actually a very basic question is, are all those faults generally reverse power flow from typical power flow directions at light load conditions, or are they additive power flow to other load conditions? And can you just give a little more texture on what kind of faults you're seeing on the thermal overload side?
Sure. I believe that the answer to your question is that yes, generally it is due to reverse power or backflow through equipment. And that equipment can either be a transmission line where the aggregate amount of distributed generation during periods of light load or can backfeed and exceed the rating of either the transmission line, or in other cases it's the transformer. So the not necessarily the 11 kV to 34.5 kV transformer, which does occur, but more recently it's been the 34.5 kV to 115 kV transformers, which can sometimes range from being rated to 25 MVA to being rated to 50 or 60 MVA in general. And so we're seeing levels of reverse power on those pieces of equipment that generally exceed that, or they can, not shouldn't say generally, but they can exceed those equipment ratings.
And is the reverse power flow ratings for those equipment generally the same as the forward power flow, or is there a reason why it's lower in any cases?
In general, we treat them as the same. I would say there are exceptions. So there is a screen that is triggered anytime that there is enough generation on a subtransmission or a distribution circuit to create the potential for a transmission element to experience reverse power or backfeed. And that screen essentially, not all transformers are necessarily equipped to handle them, depending on the protections associated with that transformer. And so then there's a protection review that's done at that point to make sure that the transformer can handle the amount of reverse power that's expected to experience. But for planning purposes, we assume that with relatively modest cost relay upgrades, that the rating of the transformer is the same for reverse power as it is for forward or normal operation.
Great. And just one last question, and it kind of gets to Brandon's question earlier. I think when you're doing these studies, you're looking at particular points of low load times. Is there a way in your studies to get any assessment of the amount of time that you're in these fault conditions?
I think the answer to your question is that there's no, right now, we do not put a amount of time for, hours of the year that we would be exposed to a particular type of contingency. The exception comes from when we are doing, which I'll get to a little bit later here, is curtailment studies, which is something we very recently started doing when we are considering offering the option of a generator being curtailed under specific circumstances. We do try to quantify, what type of risk or, what type of frequency that developer can be expected to experience that curtailment of. And so there is a study that specifically goes and looks at that, which takes into account the loading on the circuits and the aggregate generation and things like that. But in general, during the first round of studies that we do, this typical Caesar studies on the transmission system, we do not take into account frequency that's expected. We maintain a standard of that anytime there's a reliability violation, whether it's the voltage or the thermal side of it, that condition is not allowed for any amount of time.
Yep. Yeah, this is going to be a really important piece going forward, because not only for curtailment, but also for energy storage solutions as well. That you could solve it from both those dimensions if we have a good handle on the time frames. So that's going to be real important to figure out how to make those curtailment studies part of what we do. So thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. Again, I'm not as familiar with WebEx, so for some reason when I'm sharing my screen, I can't also see hands being up. So if anyone can please let me know if I'm missing something. Otherwise, I'll continue to the next slide. Okay, so a lot of information presented on this slide here, which I think will add some context to why we're seeing these issues. I want to focus here on this table here at the center top, and then the charts kind of graphically put that same information in a little bit more detail on the bottom. So of our entire system, we've experienced these constraints on 25 transmission circuits, which are those 34.5 kV circuits that we're talking about. And we mentioned before that we're seeing both high voltage and thermal In essentially every case that we've identified so far, we are seeing voltage constraints first, and then as generation continues to aggregate on that circuit, the second level of violation we see is usually thermal. I do think that we've seen a case very recently that we don't have all of our data on yet, where I think it was the first case in our system where we've seen a thermal constraint prior to a voltage constraint, so that can happen. But I'm putting these numbers up here in general to show that at least on our system, the first constraint that we're seeing is usually voltage, and then the second constraint becomes thermal. I do want to add a little bit of context that NYSEG system specifically, I think we cover area-wise about 1/3 of the state of New York, but population-wise, I think it's about 1/10 of the state of New York. What that means is that we have a lot of our system that is relatively rural compared to many utilities, meaning that we have very long radial circuits at relatively low voltages, carrying very low amounts of load. And so I think that speaks significantly to why we're seeing these voltage issues rather occur before the thermal issues. So this proposed generation, what I'm saying, for 47 megawatts that's shown here in average, is meaning that you can have, let's say you have 4 or 5 distribution circuits that feed up to the same 34.5 kV point, or the same medium voltage transmission point. What I'm saying is the aggregate of generation proposed on all of those 4 or 5 circuits together to totals up to an average of 47 megawatts at the point of interconnection that the transmission system sees. And so what that is, more detail of that is added here on this bottom left graph, because it's very much a wide range of numbers. Focusing on the green bars, you can see the y-axis here is the number of megawatts that we're seeing proposed per encumbered site, and then the x-axis is each unique site. It's just a normal site ID. You'll see it only goes up to 18 vice the 25 that I've stated. There's sometimes where multiple circuits feed up to the same site, and so there are actually 18 unique sites in our system where we're experiencing these constraints. So that's the reason why you're seeing that discrepancy there. But those numbers, even though I say the average is 47, it ranges from at its lowest just above 20 to 25, and then at its highest we're seeing over 70 megawatts of distributed generation. This is again utility scale distributed generation proposed on a handful of distribution circuits that feed up to the same transmission point where the constraint is being experienced. So that's what the green bars are showing. The red bars are talking about how much of that contribution is from a single developer. And so what you may have experienced in some locations at your sites is developers, the size limitation for going through the CER process is 5 megawatts. And so to meet that limitation, it's common that developers will take a 20 or 30 megawatt site and break that up into increments of 5 megawatts, which still effectively have the same point of interconnection, but are able to proceed through the CER process there. And so I wanted to point out that in all of the unique cases that we have, that is at least a contributing factor. And oftentimes it's not the driving factor, but it is, we have in all these cases seen a single developer propose in excess of 5 megawatts, whether that's ranging from about 10 megawatts at the lowest, so in some more extreme cases up to 35 megawatts of generation, feeding up to the same transmission point of interconnection and contributing to where we're seeing these constraints. Just to go over a quick example, you can look at number 4 here. What this is saying is that on all the circuits that are feeding up to the point where we're having this transmission constraint, the total amount of generation proposed is 57 megawatts. And the contribution of that is that there is one developer that's proposing a total of 20 megawatts of generation broken up into 5 megawatt increments. So obviously they're not the only thing driving that. Just an interesting point that I found was that this was a contributing factor in at least all of the unique cases that we've found. So before I open the discussion to talk more about that, just covering the last metric that I'm showing here to kind of explain why we're seeing this issue is what we have is a generation to load ratio of average of 1200%. What that means is that in an area where the load, and when I refer to load, I mean the daytime light load, is 1 megawatt, we're seeing an average of 12 megawatts of generation proposed on that circuit. So we have a handful of circuits, or more than a handful, where the daytime light load is easily in the 3 to 4 megawatt range. you know, for a 3 megawatt daytime light load, we're seeing an average of, you know, multiply that there, 36 megawatts of generation. And then this graph on the bottom right just kind of helps visualize that, where the lowest ratio we're seeing is about 500. And then in extreme cases, we're seeing above 2,000, meaning that for every megawatt of generation, it would be over, or for every megawatt of load that we're seeing, it'd be over 20 megawatts of generation. I thought that was a particularly important point to highlight. As I mentioned, we have a large amount of our system that's rural. And so that can mean, you know, a 20 or 30 mile, 34.5 kV radial circuit that isn't necessarily networked with the rest of the system, that has historically served 2 or 3 megawatts of load during light load, and, you know, 5 or 6 megawatts during peak load times, and now is having, you know, 30 to 40 megawatts of generation installed on it. Kind of helps understand why we're seeing these voltage and thermal issues. So that more or less covers what I wanted to discuss on this slide. Are there questions? Okay, great. And if I'm missing any hands, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next slide. So to talk about how this is handled from a process perspective, you know, going back to that same 3 system breakdown that I was showing earlier, you know, if constraints are identified on the 115 kV network, in general, those are being handled by CLCPA or the New York RIP effort. So there's a major effort going on to help resolve the constraints that are identified at the high voltage transmission network. Similarly, jumping over to the lower voltage side, the distribution side of things, the SIR process is extremely effective at identifying system upgrades. You know, whether it's something like, increasing the rating of part of a distribution circuit, replacing voltage regulators, or even a distribution transformer. The SIR process is perfect for resolving those type of constraints. Where we're seeing challenges is kind of in the middle here, and like what I've been saying on the 34.5 kV network, where a lot of times the solution isn't as simple as, you know, just uprating a line, or if we do have to increase the rating of a line, it can readily be 20 or 30 miles worth of 34.5 kV circuit, which is generally an unbearable cost for projects of this size. And in some cases, depending on how much generation is proposed, sometimes the solution isn't even as simple as uprating a circuit or increasing the size of a transformer. Sometimes just based off of the strength of the network in that area, we have to find a way to change the local topology, whether that means trying to bring in a new circuit or get more creative with our solution development. There's a wide range of issues that can pop up at this voltage level that you don't necessarily see at the distribution level, and that aren't necessarily going to get caught by the efforts that are being targeted to the higher voltage level. So there's this area in the middle where we're struggling, particularly finding solutions. These can take more time than generally the SIR process allows. And so that's more or less what I'm talking about down here, is saying that it's very time intensive. Once we get into this, it's kind of like a local area study, and we try to come up with alternatives. But obviously our intent is only to find the lowest cost option for the developer. We're very clear that when we do require upgrades, we are only requiring the developer to mitigate their impact to the system. We, under no conditions do we ever try to hold them responsible for improving the system above what it was prior to their project. And so we're very careful with that and want to make sure that we're not pushing our responsibilities onto the developer. But developing time and cost estimates for that can be a struggle. And then modeling limitations is the other point to bring into it. We have our transmission team, which normally deals with PSSC. We've got our distribution team that normally deals with SIME. And there's a point where those models just don't overlap. Usually there's maybe one equipment boundary where they do meet. But not only models the limitations, our teams that use those different softwares can sometimes struggle with communicating to each other, how to, where one model starts and the other model ends, just to make sure that, the issues that we're seeing are legitimate. And so we've done a lot of improvements lately with having a tighter communication between our distribution and transmission teams. But obviously there's still a ways to go. Then just the other point that I did add up here is that our local transmission system for NYSEG and RG&E is about 2,500 miles. of 115 kV and above line, but we're actually even higher than that for what we're calling our sub-transmission network, our 34 and a half and 46 kV networks. And so you can see that can be it's a very large part of the network that we're struggling to resolve constraints on. Any questions on this slide before I move to the last slide?
Yeah, hey, Mark, it's John Borcher.
Hi.
Just a quick question. I think you're correct that most of the utilities don't have the same type of structure with an extensive sub-transmission. What types of models do you use for your sub-transmission, and is it more of a transmission type models? And then do you include your sub-transmission as part of your local transmission plan and planning? Or is it something completely separate from both local transmission and distribution? For instance, when with the local transmission, in many there's quite a bit of, say, official reporting out to the NISO and such. Just curious how NISIG does theirs.
Sure. So to answer your first question, in general, the 34.5 kV network is considered to be transmission and is studied as transmission. So it's in our transmission models for PSSC. It's in the same model as our higher voltage system. There are exceptions to that where there are specific 34.5 kV circuits that are treated as distribution. But in general, and where we're seeing this, these constraints are on the transmission models in general. So there are also constraints on distribution, but in general, they can be handled without upgrades as complex as the constraints we're talking about today. And then to answer the second part of your question, the 34.5 kV transmission network, the 34.5 kV network that we consider to be transmission is covered by our local area studies, our LTP plan. In general, I would say there is some distinction as far as what contingencies are valid and what voltage level those contingencies are valid on. And so we don't necessarily enforce, obviously we don't enforce BES standards on our 34.5 kV network, which is non-BES. So I want to avoid the impression that we're overbuilding our sub-transmission network or anything. But in general, we do study it at the same time that we study our 115 kV and above network. Does that answer your questions?
It does, thank you.
Hey, Mark,
Fantastic.
This is Andy Owens at DPS. I
Andy.
was wondering either from you or John or someone else within the JU could answer the question. I'm not sure, but I believe that the hosting capacity analyses that are done by the utilities are done strictly at the distribution level. Is that accurate, or are sub-transmission facilities incorporated into that hosting capacity analysis?
So I'd like to take the first shot at responding to that, which is that yes, the hosting capacity analysis that we have done is limited to the distribution system. And I'll talk a little bit about how we would hope to expand that to some extent on the sub-transmission network, not necessarily hosting capacity analysis, but give some type of indicator of where we think capacity will be available. And I'll talk briefly about that on the next slide. But the reason why it would be very difficult to expand a traditional hosting capacity analysis that could be applicable to the distribution system is the sub-transmission system that we have is networked. And so there are a range of different conditions where, hosting capacity under one system condition might be different than hosting capacity under another system condition. And so it's not as straightforward of an answer. But the short answer to your question is that for our system, the system where I'm talking about seeing these constraints in the 34.5 kV network, we do not have the hosting capacity that you're referring to listed.
All right, so the thought I was having was that this hosting capacity analysis and the data that goes out to the developers and stakeholders could be giving a wrong understanding to those people as to what's really there for
Correct.
hosting capacity. And so I think that that's an important point. I don't know how well the developers on the line recognize that, but
So
go ahead.
I was going to say that one thing that we do or have started doing in the past about year and a half, once we started identifying these constraints, we do have a list that we post publicly. You know, within a couple of days of identifying a constraint on the system, we keep this list updated to on our website where we have all of our interconnection information saying, you know, these are circuits where these constraints have been identified. And, you know, as soon as we get that information on our side, we try to make that publicly available as quickly as possible because, you know, obviously if we haven't identified the constraint, it's nothing that we know about yet. But as soon as we have that information, we do try to make sure that we share it as quickly as possible because we want to be as transparent as we can be.
Yeah, and this is Jason. The other to kind of build on what Mark was talking about, you know, we've also, you know, if an area has been identified as, you know, constrained, it's on the website, you know, through the hosting capacity map and everything. But also if for some reason an applicant applies in that area, that we've talked more about, you know, making sure that gets flagged in the preliminary review stage, so it doesn't make it to the CSER analysis stage and money gets spent. You know, it gets flagged, you know, early on in the process. And you know, Kat had mentioned kind of something, had a question along those lines where, you know, if it's known that this is a constrained area and there's an application that comes in, it should get communicated to the applicant, you know, early in the process so that it doesn't move forward without the, you know, the knowledge that this is a constrained area.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Yeah. Hey, Jason, it's Liz. Although that's true, and I appreciate NYSEG's efforts to get more transparency around these problems. But just as a footnote, while it's really critical for the utility to, you know, raise the problem early, there are some cases where it remains the developer's option. If they really want to go ahead and study it, you know, they may do so, and that has happened on occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Liz's point, you know, we do post this. I think the terminology we use are encumbered circuits. You know, if a developer absolutely has is limited in where they can go and they do want to pursue interconnection with encumbered circuits, it's obviously something we would study. You know, the upgrades might end up being a significant cost, but we never, you know, reject an application. We try to work with them, and sometimes there's not an easy answer, but we do try to make sure that we overturn every stone that we can and doing due diligence to making sure that we've tried to meet, you know, those intents as best as we can.
Mark,
So
can I ask a non-technical question?
Sure.
And we don't have to go down this rabbit hole if it's not you know, if it's irrelevant, but, you know, we're just now rolling out cost sharing 2.0. Are any of the, you know, any of the upgrades that might relieve these types of constraints included in that program, or is it different technology?
I wouldn't say it's different technology. Without going into too much detail, it's kind of a case by case basis is really the best answer that I can give.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay.
So.
Yeah, Liz, it's Tim. So, you know, if the upgrade needed ends up being equipment in the substation, then as you know, that's part of cost sharing. So if it's a reactor or SVC or you know, some other protection design scheme, something, and it's in the substation, then it would fall under cost sharing, you know, in my opinion. So that's where we would put it.
Okay, thanks.
So I think at this point I've gone pretty grossly over my allotted time. So I'd like to move to the last slide here and just cover the last bit of content that I have, and then follow up with any last questions. So just talking a little bit, kind of bringing it all to what we've been trying to do internally to mitigate some of these issues. It really kind of breaks down into three main categories. You know, in those cases where we do identify that significant mitigation is required, that can't be done within the time frame that would be required for the CER process. You know, we have essentially we're formalizing a detailed study process that does take a little bit longer, but the result of that is that we can actually give the developer an accurate cost estimate. You know, it's one thing for us to say, oh, this is going to be very expensive. It's another thing to be able to put numbers to that and say, okay, this is more precisely what the cost would be, to give you a better idea of how much really risk there is, and what our alternatives are. So that had been being done informally when we first started identifying some of these constraints, and we're working on making that a much more formal process, especially in consideration of the cost sharing order that's going out that allows inclusion of that much more easily. Then we also have a pilot program called the Flexible Capacity Interconnection Program, the FIX program. And that was what we had mentioned a little bit before about the option of curtailment. It's essentially it's kind of the precursor to a DERMS system, a distributed energy resource management system, where it's tied in with SCADA, and it could have all the projects that are part of this program are kind of on the same interface, ideally, and it would allow system operators to monitor them all at once and have them become curtailed under specific contingencies or either specific system conditions. So in particular, those cases where if the only time they would need to be curtailed is under a very rare circumstance or under the most peak of peak loading, or I guess in this case the lightest of light loading, and under all other conditions they would be completely fine, then this program is designed to take those cases and give them that option of curtailment by doing a curtailment study to determine how frequently that would have to occur, and then if that's something that is acceptable to the developer, to allow them to proceed forward. It is still in the pilot stage. We're still we've got a handful of projects that we're rolling that out for. We are hoping to expand that, but as we get our system operators more comfortable with that technology, our planners more comfortable with how it works, it is still in the pilot stage right now. And there are cases, it's not going to be a silver bullet. It doesn't fix every case. Sometimes, depending on what the issue is, there are constraints that can't necessarily resolve. And then the third thing that we're trying to work on, and this is still under development, is while we can't necessarily produce numbers that are directly equivalent to hosting capacity numbers, like can be seen on a standard radial distribution circuit, we are trying to develop a list of locations where, similar to how we have a list of circuits that are constrained, where we are working on developing a list of circuits or areas where just at a high level we can tell, okay, this is a very heavily loaded area, and we know that there's a strong enough transmission network in this area to support a significant amount of generation if it was proposed. And so providing that list and making it publicly available is our intent. We're still working out internally what criteria we want to use to put things on that list, and we're not at the point where we are ready to make that public yet, but that is what we're working towards, to kind of help again, to just constantly we're looking to increase our transparency with developers at every step of this process. So, are any questions? Or I guess I'd ask Tim Lynch if you have any other comments or statements that you wanted to make in addition to this.
No, I don't. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, so I guess I'd open this up to any other questions, or if we're too far past time.
Yeah, hi Mark, it's John Borchard again. Just one comment. Some of these proposed programs that you're piloting now, while they might help with interconnection of DER, may also lead to more curtailment of DER, which kind of there needs to be a balance there, because it's nothing worse than hooking up a bunch of DER and then having them just offline more and more. So I'm wondering, have you contemplated, or are you working on ways to analyze to what level those flexible interconnections would be less fruitful?
Yeah, so that's information we try to provide the developer when we incorporate them into this process, is to give them an idea of how much they can expect to be curtailed, which normally I guess is only under very rare circumstances to be a candidate in this program. And you're right that let's say you have 20 megawatts of generation installed and it has to get curtailed maybe 10% of the time down to 15 or down to 10. that's still for most developers going to be a better option than having to do $5 or $10 million worth of upgrades to make it so that their system is fully deliverable. And so you're absolutely right that it doesn't fully fix the problem, but it does help address the immediate issue of getting more capacity installed. Once we have firm capacity installed, it takes out the guesswork of trying to anticipate, okay, well, maybe we'll have, proposals over here, maybe we'll have proposals over there. Once we have firm locations and a firm amount, it helps us justify a future business case for why, the funding for this upgrade to allow the generator to be fully deliverable under all conditions, could maybe come from a different source other than the developer themselves.
Hey guys, this is, sorry if I may interject real quick. This is Greg Sachs with Empower, also on the ITWG side. I just wanted to pause on point, Mark, just for a second with regard to flexible interconnection. This is such a, obviously, for those of you that join the ITWG meetings on a regular basis, this is perhaps our top topic at the moment. And we're really excited in developing this conversation about what does the curtailment analysis look like. Of course, part of that curtailment analysis requires us to make various decisions about what's the principle of access, right? Are we doing last in, first out? Is it a pro rata? These are conversations we have discussed, and we're just starting to get going on the ITWG side. So anyways, I just wanted to highlight that for a second, and we're all excited about the idea of moving toward a business as usual option for all the utilities, but this is one of the fundamental parts of this conversation and our success as we determine how to define hosting capacity, because it varies depending on what level of curtailment we want to use as we start, as we continue these conversations. So anyways, just wanted to pause on that for a second, and thanks for bringing it up.
It looks like I got Bill and Zach have their hand up. Bill, do you want to go?
Yep, thanks, Jason. So, Mark, I wanted to pick up on the theme that was just talked about by John and Greg. I'm particularly curious about how you're actually doing the next step of if you do determine a fault at the subtransmission level, are you then automatically going into some sort of study of a broader time frame? And if you could just talk a little bit about how you're actually doing that broader time frame study, I think it would be very, very helpful. I would comment to John Borch's point about the long-term effect of continuing to curtail. There is a transition point in my mind when you curtail up to a point and then you add energy storage. So instead of curtailing, you're shifting. And the exact same analysis is needed for both of those. So I think there is actually a very good kind of combined thrust that can solve these problems if we have that information. So I'm really excited that you're doing this. Can you talk a little bit about how you then do that next step of that study and what information you actually get out? Do you have hourly for each day? How are you doing it?
Sure. So I think to answer your first question of, when do we transition to that type of study, that the trigger is not just that there's a constraint identified on this subtransmission network. There's a range of options we go through when a constraint is identified that we call like simple options, that don't necessarily require a detailed study. If we can have something like power factor operation, or if it is something as simple as replacing a transformer with a larger unit, or another type of upgrade that is relatively straightforward and doesn't necessarily require a detailed study, we do provide those mitigation options just upfront with normal Caesar response. If for whatever reason those simple mitigation options are not applicable, that's when we give the developer as much detail as we can about the constraints that we're seeing, and then provide them the option to transition to this detailed study that we're discussing here in the first bullet. And then the time frame with that, I think it's usually like 8 to 10 weeks. It's similar to a standard system impact study, where what we try to do is look at any non-traditional solutions that we could possibly do, whether, again, the goal is to find the lowest cost way to interconnect the developer with the the minimum amount of upgrades required. And so we try to provide a couple of different options with that. The output is a report that goes through and talks about some more details of the technical constraints that were identified, as well as what our proposed solutions are, along with cost estimates for what those solutions would be. And that's separate again from the curtailment study that would be done as part of the flexible interconnection program, which is where the curtailment study would be occurring. As far as the details of how that curtailment study or what the outputs of that curtailment study would be, I don't have a lot of technical expertise on that specifically. There's a different team that actually runs those studies. And this is a pretty new program, and so I don't know how many examples we have of completed studies that we could use, but I do know that they basically look at hourly loading when available, and essentially come up with a percentage of the frequency that curtailment could be expected, or if we have, if the curtailment is expected to occur under a specific contingency, we could go back and look at historically how frequently in the past has that contingency occurred, and we try to provide, statistics associated with, what we anticipate. Obviously, past performance is not indicative of future performance, but it can at least give as much information as we have to help the developer, bound the risk that they're taking as far as what they can expect for curtailment.
So when you say that look at hourly loading, that's 8760 for a typical year, a peak year, the recent year.
So the honest answer is that we look at whatever we have available. If we have that type of loading available for the circuits, then absolutely we use that. If there are cases where we don't necessarily have that level of fidelity for every part of our system, and then it's going to vary depending on what information we do have available, and going based off of that.
Makes sense. Thank you.
So I just wanted to jump in quick and do a time check. And I think, Mark, really appreciate your experience and feedback and all this, and the presentation has been great. As far as from the industry group, do we want to continue questions for Mark on this? Do you want to jump into hold off on any more questions and jump into the other document? Just want to make sure we provide enough time to cover everything. Again, I'm looking at this as a meeting for the stakeholders to ask questions. So if we want to stay on this track, we certainly can. I just wanted to, check and make sure Mark is good with his time schedule as well.
Yeah, I can support with whatever you need.
Okay. And
Jason, appreciate you checking in. This is Zach with Nicia. I would suggest we continue with the discussion as is. It looks like we're wrapping up here pretty soon anyway, but this has been great. This is exactly what we needed.
Okay.
We've already touched on a lot of points that we were going to touch on, so I think this is good.
No, I tend to agree. I just wanted to check in. So okay, so yeah. I think Zach, if you had your hand up, and then I think Bart can go after that.
Yeah, really appreciate this, Jason and Mark. Great stuff so far. So I should have known that Bill was going to touch on the point that I was going to bring up about storage and its interplay with flexible interconnection, and just kind of reiterate the point that I don't see this kind of creating an issue down the road. I see this kind of easing an issue now as we work towards better grid planning and upgrade processes and more widespread storage implementation. So I agree that it's with Bill, it's a kind of natural fit. And also, in terms of grid upgrades, right? So once we start getting curtailed, that it becomes uneconomic to develop there, that's when we start, that's kind of a trigger for, okay, let's look at a grid upgrade here. So I guess just quick question on that. And you may have already answered this in ITWG, so I apologize, but have you been studying storage as part of this flexible interconnection pilot at all, or looking at how to incorporate it?
Tim, I might turn to you for an answer on that. To my knowledge, I don't think we have been. I think as so far with the cases where we've executed this program, I believe that it's been limited to curtailment. I don't know if storage has come into that discussion as of yet. Tim, do you know if that's correct or if there's an intention?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of your answer there. That just for the group, I mean, there's another group in the company, not me and not Mark, that runs these pilots, but I'm not aware that there was a battery component, but we can double check it. If we're wrong, we'll come back.
And just from Jason, I'm on, the storage discussion really hasn't come up to my knowledge for these projects either, just to put my 2 cents in.
Yeah.
And neither in the ITWG, we really haven't got into that aspect with storage associated with flexible interconnect yet either, so.
I guess this is Andy. I wouldn't want to put words in Bill's mouth, but I would think that that storage at this point, there's enough information out there, enough experience and knowledge that it should be one of the alternatives that's evaluated anytime there's a constraint that needs to be fixed. It should just be one of the things that comes into play, and if storage is required, or if it turns out storage looks like it's the best solution, then we can figure out how to trigger, like a procurement or something like that, that opens it up.
Hold on 1 second, I gotta weigh in here. Hey Andy, it's John Borchert. I don't want to say challenge that, but I do know that we are looking at it as part of the ATWG. Storage, we do know it's a solution, but how to actually apply it in a situation like this is still a bit of a challenge. And I think just getting back to even the flexible interconnect, there are a lot of things that need to be, I would just say, detailed out before we can move this to a wholesale. Even things like the order of, say, curtailment, once you have multiple DER within an area, how they're curtailed, when they're curtailed, the systems necessary. There's a lot to do here. So I agree, it is something that we can move toward, but
that's all I was trying. That's all I was trying to say. And I understand what you're saying and appreciate it.
Thank you.
It just seemed like there was starting to sound like there was a little bit of a void there with regards to active consideration of storage, where it could provide a benefit. But I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
And
this is Zach with Nancy. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I think, and Andy, you could put words in my mouth all day long when you say these things, but because I fully agree with you, obviously, the couple considerations here. One is that clearly, any time you're doing curtailment to a renewable site, from a technical standpoint, if you put storage there that has the capacity, it can do the curtailment, and still save the energy. So we're really talking about how we do it, not whether it can be done. And as this becomes more important going forward, it's more important to do it. I would also say that we are in the ITWG. We have had conversations about hybrid systems, and the same kind of considerations come localized at hybrid systems. The interesting opportunity here is to go beyond hybrid systems and to actually decouple the two. And that's something that we've got a lot of rule figuring out to do, but it's very important to do it. The other important consideration here is that by doing that, by using storage as opposed to curtailment, you actually have eliminated that other problem that you just mentioned of the order of curtailment to some extent. So we have a few different things that we need to work through, and I realize there are a lot of groups working it through. But it's really important that we do keep this on the table, particularly in the CGPP process. So I do appreciate people bringing up the fact that that's valuable.
Yeah, agreed, Bill. And I was just going to suggest that it sounds like we should start incorporating storage into these discussions, and just speaking to John's point, agreed. There's a good amount to figure out. I think there's plenty of ways it can happen immediately, which we're seeing. Really, in the end, I think it boils down to different contracts. But as much as, we need to start digging into these conversations as much as possible and start spending our time on this. I think, agree with that point, and it shouldn't slow us down.
I want to, Bart, I think you still have your hand up. I want to make sure you get your comments in.
Just a very good presentation, Mark. This is Bert Franny from National Grid. I just had a clarifying question. Is the process gap and challenges observed when you see generation connecting to the sub-transmission, either wholesale or DER?
Maybe you can rephrase your question. I guess the issue that we're seeing is specifically with generation that's connected to the distribution system and then back feeding up to the transmission system. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was just trying to clarify. If it goes down to your 34.5 with a direct interconnect, you're not seeing a process gap or a challenge in planning there, correct?
Sure, yeah, that's correct. And part of that comes from, a generator that goes through, either our internal process for outside of any generator that goes through either the New York ISO process or our internal process for projects that are larger than the SIR. We aren't seeing issues with those as much. There are different voltage regulation opportunities that come into play there, so that they can usually mitigate any voltage issues we see. And we do still sometimes see thermal constraints associated with some of those projects at the same interface of the 115 to 34.5 kV transformers. So that has occasionally popped up, but that is more of like a one or two cases and not a very frequent system. So not a very frequent occurrence. The majority of these issues are with the distribution connected generation specifically.
Okay, thanks.
And this is Jason. I just wanted to reemphasize, and I think Greg had mentioned it, we are actively talking, and have been for, we've got a couple presentations through the ITWG group on the flexible interconnection concept. We've got some additional efforts going on, to level set where all the utilities are with this new technology, but we are just in the beginning stages of this. So I just wanted to reemphasize that. Any other questions for Mark on his presentation?
I just wanted to say that Mark did an excellent job. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And this is, it's kind of, a topic that I know we've discussed in specifically for NYSEG projects, between Tim, Mark, and specific developers. We've talked about it in the ITWG group a bit, but I really thought it would be a good lead in and a good topic to start this group with, to emphasize and highlight some of the concerns and constraints that are there, as well as, the planning that's going to need to go into, the CGPP in the future to coordinate between the D, sub-T, and transmission system. So I really appreciate this presentation, Mark, and you were on the hot seat for a while and did a great job answering all the questions.
Thank you.
Anything else on this before we transition over? Okay, so as part of this effort, I had asked the industry to put together, their thoughts and comments on the overall distribution planning process. And I know a lot of this is targeted around DER, and we've had some initial discussions on this as part of the ITWG group. But I was really hoping to have something, on paper for the utilities to kind of look at and review prior to this meeting, and as maybe sort of a straw man to help lead the conversation in the direction that the stakeholders are looking for. So, and I shared this with everybody. Hopefully everyone had a chance to take a look at it. And I don't know if it's Greg, Zach, Drew, I don't know if you guys want to kind of walk through this first or whatnot, but I think this will help lead the discussion and hit on some of the points that they have not, I want to say concerns, but thoughts and comments on, and hopefully the JU can respond accordingly. So I don't know if Greg or Zach or Drew, if you guys how you guys want to proceed from here. Again, I'm looking for the stakeholders to, ask questions and get their thoughts out there.
Yep. Go ahead, Greg. Thank you.
A little bit if you'd like, Zach.
Yep.
Zach, unless you want to take the lead, that's fine with me.
All you. Thanks, Greg.
All right, well, thanks, guys. I guess I'll make a few comments here. This has evolved a little bit. We first created this, I think a couple months ago. I think some of this information at the top here is a little bit dated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you just scroll down a little bit, Jason. So this first section here where it says ad hoc, this is really just us trying to understand what was going on with the different groups. There's really nothing that we need to review right now. We're just trying to understand what was going on with each one of the different sections. So we can scroll down to.
And Greg, I just wanted to mention, that there is there is going to be a permanent stakeholder advisory group, the EPAC group, as part of this overall CGPP, CLCPA effort going forward. So just wanted to kind of mention and identify that.
That sounds great. Yeah, I mean, just to comment on this for a minute, I guess. It's definitely tricky to follow what all the different groups are and what the state of the groups are. So really, like I said, nothing more to add at the moment. Happy to be part of this particular group.
Yeah, Greg, if I can chime in here too, and this is probably directed at Jason and DPS folks. So is this the only CGPP subgroup? We have here highlighted another kind of local and bulk subgroup. I know that I think Bill has proposed a subgroup on modeling, scenarios. Has there been any other discussion of forming another subgroup?
Hi, Zach, it's Liz. To date, I haven't been asked to assemble any specific subgroups, related to the ongoing CGPP stakeholder, the technical conferences that we've been having. The invitation's out there, but so far, no. So the distribution planning group is the only sub effort that's been officially launched.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Liz.
And I want to emphasize or remind people or tell folks, if you don't already know, there will be, as Jason said, the JU proposal for the CGPP includes a permanent ongoing stakeholder consultation structure. So that's part of the proposal, and we certainly welcome, comments on that at the appropriate time, because just because they proposed it doesn't mean it's exactly what the commission should do, but it's part of the vision for the CGPP.
Liz, Bill here, if I could just clarify your answer a little bit here. I think we've talked about and suggested a subgroup on the scenario planning and then how you act upon that and solution sets around the scenario planning and flexible probabilistic modeling. And my understanding was you wanted to wait to at least engage the utilities in that subgroup until after we had the technical conference that addressed that topic.
Okay, Bill, I'm not remembering. We certainly want to have that tech conference. I think we just scheduled it for June 15th. So if you want to, if you think that that's going to be a topic that's going to need follow-up, please drop me a note about that, because it was not on my radar.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do believe that's an area we do want a subgroup, and
Yeah,
so if we're wanting to get going on that prior to the conference, I think that would be great.
okay.
And it's unfortunate that I actually personally have a conflict on the June 15th, but we're going to try to get people there, and hopefully we'll get the recording up as fast as possible too.
Yeah,
So
too
thank you.
bad. Yeah, but do drop me a note if you would. Thanks.
Okay, great.
And I think if I remember, the joint utilities agreed that that was, or at least some folks from the utilities agreed that that was a subgroup that we should form. Um, so at least we have some buy-in. I'm hoping, Liz, to get that moving.
The criteria, I've tried to talk about this before we kicked off this interim stakeholder process. I'm perfectly willing to convene subgroups so long as, there's some kind of, so long as we understand what some of the questions are and we know we have substantive things to talk about. And the purpose of running the technical conferences is to give everybody, background, overview, information to help elicit, things that need to be developed further. So, it's a low threshold, but there is a little bit of a threshold as far as, asking people to commit more time to an issue. That's all.
So do we want to continue on with this document here?
So, all right, so the next, just in terms of jargon, in terminology, you can see the next all cap section there. It says for DPS.
Yeah,
Jason,
I don't know if others are having this problem, but I can barely hear the speaker.
Okay, test.
Greg,
Sorry,
I can hear you. Greg, you're a little low.
Okay, 1 second. Where to adjust that?
It's good for me.
So test. Let's try that. Testing. Does that?
You are louder, yes.
Okay. Someone showed me the secret location where they buried that in the Cisco system the other day. So kudos to them. Okay, so the next all cap section there is where it says for DPS. So this was in response when you asked us, Jason, to kind of give us our initial thoughts, but these are meant to be general industry comments regarding the distribution planning process. So what are our thoughts? So you can scroll down, Jason. Okay, so the big picture overarching vision, I think we're all on the same page here. So there's really not much time to spend. Is obviously we want to maximize the distribution hosting capacity for the least cost per kW for new kW capacity as quickly as possible. We can dig into the words on that and what that implies, but I think we all just get the general idea here is, however, we want to keep in mind the cost aspect in a little bit, which we'll get to a little bit farther down below. What does that mean in terms of the big picture goal? Just a couple of quick notes on these other bullets here. Ensure there is sufficient coordination between distribution plans and local transmission infrastructure that doesn't become a bottleneck for continued DER deployment. Obviously, we're on the same page. We just heard a great presentation on that. This third bullet here is something that many of you have heard me try to champion in the past, which is the idea of a publicly available dashboard where we can track this across New York State and across utilities. Hosting capacity maps are great, but they're not really going to tell us whether or not what we're actually achieving. I know this is not necessarily directly related to this process, but we think that maybe it should be, because again, the dashboard is what tells us. So as we make improvements, or as we change the way we define hosting capacity, or as new stuff comes online, like the rate at which it's coming online, this dashboard is meant to give us that visibility to see how we're doing at our goals. As we make improvements over the next 5-10 years, we should see the numbers change over time. So again, I'm just putting another pitch in for the importance of something that seems to be very unique and is surprising, for some sort of master dashboard with key metrics which tell us where we're at, helps us benchmark across the state. I don't need to dive into that. We published a white paper like 2 years ago on this. We let it kind of die down. We're waiting for it to see if anything happens with the IEDR initiative, but Anyway, so I'm just highlighting that as a key thing that we wanted to keep in mind. Okay, I'm actually going to jump down. There's other stakeholders that may want to weigh in here a little bit more, obviously, on some of these other points that we've added. But I'm going to jump to this next bullet here, 2 fundamental categories of improvements. I think we all agree on these as well. One is like, so I'm going to use the second one first, major infrastructure upgrades. That's the easy one, right? We all know about that. That's the substation. You know, that's like replacing the transformer substation bank, or some sort of physical infrastructure, right? The other just simple bucket is the technology upgrades. And I think that what we're trying to get at with the technology upgrades category is the concepts of things such as hosting capacity. So changes to the way we look at the system, the way we do the math, the smart systems, the control systems, that will allow us to increase hosting capacity without having to spend on major infrastructure. Again, that's a very simple concept. I know there's so much published on that already, but we're just highlighting that separation between the two. And we would pick something like flexible interconnection as falling into that technology upgrade bucket, so to speak. The next major bullet we have there is distribution, let's see, planning feedback for greater CGPP process. So ensure, okay, here's what I'm getting at. Here's what we're getting at in this point here. This is just key feedback for the process. So here we are, we're the distribution planning group. We want to ensure that distribution generation is properly valued throughout the CGPP process, because, in other words, a lot of times the distribution additions we make won't be the cheapest, but there is additional value associated with enabling a distribution level connection, right? So here's what I'm getting. Here's another way to say this. If we were purely looking at the cheapest, the least expensive cost per kW in terms of increasing, we would have the fewest interconnections possible that are connected to a transmission system, right? But there's value in making sure that those additional connections are distribution based. And again, we all know this, and this is why we're all here right now. This is why Jason and others are working so hard on this, and Liz. So I don't really need to belabor this point, but we just don't want to undervalue the distribution side connections. And there's so much that we could say here, in terms of what sorts of contractors, what sorts of developers are able to even participate in sub-transmission or transmission direct connections versus the enabling many more contractors and developers to participate in the distribution side. So I'm just highlighting that this is key for us to keep in mind, is when we do finally go to do the cost benefit analysis, that we discuss the metrics associated with distribution level connections. And by the way, if anybody wants to interject, you're certainly welcome to. I'll keep moving here, and I know that I'm, saying things that are that many of us have heard before. So specific industry goals and expectations from the distribution planning process. So you can see these are just some of the more tangible things that we came up with. So the first one here is just what's the best methodology for identifying feeders and substations that need upgrading? That's a goal, right? That should be a goal of this of the planning process. Prioritize near-term technologies, right? Here's this, I mentioned technologies up at the top there, the 2 big buckets, right? So here's where we're throwing in the DERMS, the flexible interconnection, et cetera, will have the greatest impact on enabling DER penetration without massive infrastructure upgrades that take a long time to design and implement and ultimately execute. Next bullet there, determine, review how these technologies must manifest in the actual SIR language changes. Now, this is really interesting too. is, you know, we've just started to tiptoe into this conversation about the flexible interconnection, but what does it actually look like in SIR revisions? You know, how do we want to redline the actual SIR? You know, having, you know, the last round of the revisions we made were pretty, you know, we're pretty comprehensive, but it'll be interesting to see where we actually want to start to integrate that into the SIR. Next item there is identify a transparent and collaborative process to properly forecast DER and distribution planning that's consistent between utilities. I think there's been a little bit of, you know, for some of us, like including myself, that isn't as involved in this space on the developer side, I'm a little bit unclear how some of these things take place. So I think helping us better understand will be great. Clear metrics to account for DER, megawatt enabled benefits to track progress. And again, so there's some more stuff here. I want to invite any of my colleagues, you know, Zach or anybody else to kind of weigh in on some of these topics as well. Kat, I know you've put some work into some of these comments additionally as well.
Yeah, I could speak to the next bullet. The stakeholder engagement in identifying the projects speaks about when a location is considered, the upgrade is considered. We should have a stakeholder involvement process that figures out what is the actual potential of how much DR we can fit in. It is going to connect in the next 5 to 10 years, depending on the town, how pro solar they are and what the trend in the town is. The next point is from a technical conference. I think Bill suggested is when the transmission and sub-transmission scenario planning considers long-term focus, and which does not address the need for QDR, which really have a really short-term needs, basically not more than a year or 1.5 years. So how would these be prioritized in those scenario planning? And the third bullet is addressing the bottlenecks, exactly what we're speaking about. Yeah, so how are these ranked in line with other upgrades? Let's say you have a lot of hosting capacity on the distribution side, and the congestion is on the transmission side. And if we have a similar congestion, which upgrading that equipment would increase lesser hosting capacity, how are these valued? Or let's say the same difference in hosting capacity, which one would be prioritized, and what would be the criteria on that? Yeah, I would also invite other stakeholders who contributed to these above bullets. Greg missed. Yeah.
I think I can keep going here for a little bit if someone else wants to jump in. Otherwise, we can kind of close out this phase of it and open it up for discussion, of course. So
okay, Greg, I was just going to say, you know, I don't know if there's specific, I mean, we got about a half hour left. If there's specific questions we want to kind of target in on and ask the JU, you know, input while we have them, you know, here today, you know, I think that might be useful time management going forward. So I'll leave it up to you guys.
I can jump in here. This is Zach with Nicaea. So I'm not sure, you know, I think what we've done here is list out a number of questions, some suggestions, recommendations. And so I'm not sure there's one in particular question we could focus on. I think what might be most useful is kind of to hear, you know, any JU feedback to what we just went through, you know, with the understanding this was shared in advance. And then I might suggest, you know, if that doesn't lead to a discussion, one of the topics that's come up previously in the technical conference was, DER modeling. And, I think we learned a little bit about how the joint utilities are doing that. It's mostly through kind of interconnection queue. And I think, that might be a good place for this group to discuss how might we change that. And I'd love for that discussion to start with how, the joint utilities might, do they have a proposal for changing that as we interconnect more projects? Or, kind of how are we all thinking about that? But I'll stop there. I know Kat has a question as well.
Yeah, I know. I think it might be helpful to, maybe phrase this in a more specific way. So hopefully this isn't too far off the mark in terms of like what you're trying to facilitate, Jason. I guess my question to the utilities is, obviously in 2020, when the New York JU put together kind of their potential infrastructure upgrades and kind of outlook on what distribution infrastructure may be necessary to meet CLCPA goals. I was interested in understanding from the utilities perspective, like what they need in terms of planning horizon, inputs to the planning process in order to do that successfully. I know what you did in 2020 was a very quick turnaround effort, and you were looking at probably things that you don't typically look at under your existing planning and capital planning process. So I was really interested in understanding from the utilities, like what inputs do you think you need in order to kind of plan in a more holistic long-term fashion such that the CGPP can be successful overall? Was that a specific question or a broad question? Kat doesn't know, but if anyone has any thoughts to share, I think that would be helpful because I think that will help us identify maybe where some of the gaps are and where we could dig in a bit further.
Yeah, it's Liz Grisaro, and I actually welcome that question. And if you don't mind hearing, from the DPS perspective, I'd like to share that. And that is, what we see as the urgent task at hand, and that we are asking you guys to help with. The urgent task at hand is to fulfill the statutory mandate that the utilities have plans that identify upgrades to their distribution systems that are needed to support CLCPA. We told everybody that in order to have plans, you have to have a planning process. So that we see the task at hand for this group or any other folks who want to join it. We see the task at hand developing and documenting the distribution planning process that the utilities will use in order to identify those necessary system investments. Does that help?
Yep, no, that does help, Liz. And I guess my question is I guess back to the utilities, what it is, what do they need? What are they lacking currently, right? That they may not have in their repertoire of information. So for example, when I look at the utility DSIPs, I see a lot of utilities have put some time and investment into probabilistic scenario planning and data analytics and such. And so maybe there are tools they already have at their disposal, or maybe there's something incremental that we need to talk about here, which is something similar to maybe what we're talking about in Massachusetts, which is there a underlying, DER forecasting process that industry and other stakeholders need to participate in order to provide, an additional input into that process, into the overall process design, I guess I should say.
This is Tom from National Grid. I think that's a good point, and something worth talking about. I help coordinate some of our forecasting efforts in Grid, and I do work in our distribution planning group, so I'm fairly familiar with our interconnection policies. And of course, we are trying to do some more long-term planning. One of the big ways we plan on doing that is to take advantage of the new cost share mechanism, right? We were given a little bit of breathing room, that 2% bucket, to do a little bit of advanced planning. I think it ends up being something like 10 or 15 million a year, so not a lot to do with it, but we are starting to get some of that wiggle room. And I think you nailed it. Forecasting becomes one of the more difficult things when we look at our data systems. Really, we have two primary drivers to build our forecasts off of, and that's the queue that we see from developers and policy expectations. And then we layer in, we try to make developer decisions for you. I could tell from personal experience. It's funny, we built a forecasting engine that's a little more planner focused. It was built by planners, and we forecasted all the solar in areas where there was hosting capacity, and saw a result that wasn't necessarily in line with what we were seeing in the queue. So we added in a little bit of randomness. We added in some consideration that we think affect developer decisions a little more around land acquisition and other things that might drive to suboptimal hosting capacity locations. So absolutely, I think if there's ways that we can, not necessarily saying that means firming up the queue, because we appreciate that the developer community needs the flexibility they have already in that queue, even if that makes it a little harder for us to forecast. But if there are ways we can work with the developer community to get a little better idea of even enhance beyond the information we get through the queue to help us with some of that scenario planning, it will certainly help us decide some of those, you call it make ready if you want, hosting capacity type upgrades through cost share, and how to place them in a very efficient way. But right now, with the amount of flexibility in the queue and how policy driven everything is, the scenarios tend to vary widely, which makes it high risk to make any definitive investment that's more than a year or two out. I think you hit the nail on the head.
That really helps, Tom. I mean, the other thing that is, in the back of my mind, and again, we're kind of doing something a little bit similar in parallel in Massachusetts, is, I would imagine that this is not just an effort for DG hosting capacity, right? This is, to Liz's point, a distribution planning process that will meet the CLCPA goals. And that includes other policy drivers as well, right? Including beneficial electrification and other things. And so, I think we may be one input and maybe a slightly large driver in the process, but I think making sure that we're identifying kind of those, multi-use benefits and identifying where those synergies lie or where they don't lie is also a very important part of what we're trying to understand in this process.
And I'll agree with what Tom said, and then just to add to that even a little bit too, is what I think would be helpful is because you can somewhat use the queue in forecasting, but I think that's also even a little bit concerning in some cases, just because we definitely see a lot of instances where applications will make the 25 or 100% payment and then withdraw. So I guess something from the developer community is like some level of indicator of like how probable maybe a project actually is. Other than just that payment, just because we have seen those projects withdraw, especially after they've gone through the actual interconnection process. I know there's probably other, areas or reasons why a project might withdraw. So maybe a little bit more detail into that, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, if I could jump in, this is Bill Acker, and this is a great conversation. And when you start thinking about if you take as a backdrop that we have to achieve a lot higher levels of renewables in the state, the interconnect process is where developers think they can put things now. It's not where we should put things in the future. It's not where if we have to expand hosting capacity to allow other things to happen. So clearly, we have to start thinking beyond just the interconnect process. And your question, Stephanie, is does that come from the developers? Does that come from the utilities? Does it come from a combination? I think is one of the key parts that we need to discuss in the coordinated grid planning process going forward. It also, Tom, I I'll use Chatham House rules, so I won't actually quote you, but I would love to quote you for the whole reason why we need the scenario planning and the solution process. Because the fact the scenarios vary widely, and we can't really look at 1 year or 2 out, becomes the fundamental issue that we need to tackle in this whole process, in my eyes. So that's, I think, the basis for why I think we need a subgroup on that whole scenario planning and solution piece going forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel free to, don't quote me, but I stand behind that. I think the rest of the utilities would too. We want to do this efficiently, and our obligation to be conservative on behalf of our customers, particularly as we adventure into new cost sharing paradigms, is the balance we have to strike. But yeah, if there's a way to sort of create a mutual dependence among the developer and utility planning communities, to set it up so that, I don't know if it's a chicken or egg, the utility builds it and then they come, or the developer points the location and then we build it and then they come. But something where there is a middle process that's more than just download the queue and see where folks either have feelers or firm projects, might be beneficial.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you.
And Tom, not to pick on National Grid, but I know that National Grid in Massachusetts has had to start evaluating this because there is a regulatory proceeding going on there around long-term DER planning. I think there's certainly an aspect of this around, understanding the current dynamics of the queue, but I think a lot of that queue, as you've already said, is, there's some flexibility, there's some non-firmness in the queue, and the future queue is going to be very responsive to what hosting capacity is available. I mean, just hosting capacity simply doesn't really exist in a meaningful way today. So I think tackling the challenge of how do you get beyond, the present queue that could just be, 2 to 3 years, right, of DER development is part of the challenge. And I'm curious to understand whether it would be helpful for the other New York joint utilities, if you haven't had exposure to it, to invite National Grid or Eversource or one of the utilities in Mass that have been doing some work in that area to talk about what they're doing in terms of forecasting future DER, to see if there's a framework that works for New York.
Something I
I
can
guess
circle back with our internal folks to talk about, but I will say, we've had some discussions, and there is a lot of overlap in the mechanisms that they're creating and some of the flexibility we were granted in cost share. So I think that's great feedback, but I also think that we might have some policy to build off of here, and maybe there's some tweaks as we develop the mechanism over the next couple of years and get it to exactly where it needs to be. But I think we have some of the tools in our toolbox, and it's just about figuring out how to use them effectively. I don't know what folks think about that.
I mean, Tom, my cat's perspective here is that I think each utility has, obviously has their own role in doing their distribution planning process. And I would just be curious to understand whether kind of this input scenario process will be different between utilities or consistent. And that's a conversation that, we can continue to evolve. But I think each utility is probably best suited to figure out how that works. It just would be helpful, I think, for there to be some level of consistency or transparency, I would say, between what the utilities are doing, how they're engaging with stakeholders, how they're facilitating that process, to what degree is it, data driven versus qualitative, that type of thing.
This is Zach on NICE. I'd definitely be interested to learn more about kind of what other tools, as kind of alluded to, what other tools are currently out there being implemented by the utilities. And then to Kat's point, this group can kind of work on coalescing that and kind of standardizing it, and certainly looking for how can the industry be helpful, in light of those potential tools and in developing new ones. And I agree, there's definitely a chicken and egg problem here.
Any other questions or comments for the specific for the JU?
Yeah, I guess this is Jared at Con Ed. I guess I would just ask a follow-up clarifying question, right? Distribution planning is a pretty broad topic. Now that for us here at Con Ed, and I'm sure for a lot of the other utilities, right? But namely here at Con Ed, when you say distribution planning, right, we're still talking about a process that works on an annual basis. It works on a 10 and a 20-year load relief basis. A lot of our distribution planning is still load relief in nature here. Obviously, some nearer term electrification, on-peak electrification, some EV proliferation for us and our networks are driving significant needs to continue to forecast out our load relief. As part of those forecasts, we obviously take into account new business and forecasted load growth, but we have a numerous amount of modifiers in our network level forecast that are inclusive of things like DG proliferation, storage expansion, EV proliferation. We forecast those as load modifiers. Those go into our overall plan. Obviously, on an annual basis, that plan, is what feeds into our non-wire solutions process, and then it's what feeds into our 10 and our 20-year load relief plans, which is kind of our larger, station upgrades and transformer upgrades. That's kind of what we consider to be distribution planning. Now, we also realize that there is now a constraint that is seen on the DG end, where we need to be looking at areas where we might have to give a little bit more focus on expanding hosting capacity, right? To the points that I've heard on the phone. I guess my question is, are we really talking about the distribution planning process, or are we talking about DER forecasting and upgrade enablement for a specific subset of what the utilities consider distribution planning?
Yeah, I think what we're doing is focusing in on a portion of distribution planning, which is DER forecasting, and looking for ways to evolve that and work towards the ultimate goals here, right? And I am thinking, as you're saying this, it might be an interesting case study with Con Ed having its kind of own megawatt goal through the 10 gigawatt program, kind of taking a look at how you guys are planning that all out, to 2030, and then seeing if we have any feedback for that.
Hey, it's Liz. I'd answer that question slightly differently, maybe with a question back to you guys, you utilities. You have existing distribution planning processes. I think the challenge that is on the table is to open up those processes and ask questions about how well do they work in terms of identifying investments that need to be made to meet CLCPA goals, all of them. And those are the kinds of, I think the question goes back to you in a sense, like, well, so how do you need to modify your existing planning processes, maybe a longer time horizon, maybe more scenarios? How do you need to modify existing planning processes to ensure that the commission is investing in, distribution upgrades that are needed to meet CLCPA? That's sort of I think the big picture ask here. And hosting capacity is kind of one aspect of that overall. Hopefully in doing the planning, you look at hosting capacity and figure out where it makes sense to expand it. But I think the larger question is, are your existing planning processes sufficient to give the commission the information it needs about where to invest ratepayer dollars to meet CLCPA objectives?
I think that was a great point there, was the point around where to invest ratepayer dollars. So I think one of the pieces is we're sort of shifting our planning paradigms and planning criteria to reflect changes in policy, right? Frankly, that first one, the fact that ratepayers receive a substantial benefit from the CLCPA goals being met, and for that reason, we can rate pay portions of it. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, that cost share 2.0 mechanism that first started opening up the door to us in distribution was phenomenal, but it fairly limited. So we're exploring with ways right now, because that has to be shared between market-driven upgrades that happen naturally, but also the ones that we would like to identify as proactive and build it and they will come. We have this area that it's super efficient to do this upgrade, and we know there's lots of land out there. Developers don't have interest for XYZ reason. Maybe we even put a moratorium up given the current hosting capacity, but we think that this is a win-win-win as far as society goes, developer location of PV. I think one of the pieces of the puzzle, one of them is that forecasting piece, which we are getting better at every day. But the other piece of the puzzle is that continuing dynamic of policy and figuring out where the limits are in terms of what's prudent to rate base. And we're very happy to see new policy come along that gives us the flexibility. And I think continuing down that path will allow us to do more in this space and be more proactive. I don't know what others think of that.
This is Andy, DPS again. I think taking what I think you were saying there a moment ago, Tom, what seems to be a gap right now is that the distribution planning, as sophisticated as it is getting at the different utilities, there's a blind spot, I think, as to where DER developers are going to be most likely to develop going into the future. So forecasting that would be, and basically that forecast would presumably have an effect on planning, and the planning would have an effect on that forecast to some extent, or to a great extent. So it's kind of like, the planning process as it is not necessarily predicting where DER development, where and to what scale and what type of DER development would likely end up producing the greatest value. And I think that the challenge is that the utilities have a great deal of insight into that, and in many cases probably more insight into that than the developers. But the developers know what it is that they need to see in order to make an investment, and it's that balance between developer investment and grid investment that ends up creating the total solution. And so the forecasting and planning, I think, has to somehow do a better job of tying in where the greatest value is for DER development.
Andy, I think you hit the nail on the head. But, going all the way back to, I think, where we were trying to get with beneficial locations of DER in the first or second DSIP. Exactly. We see it as sort of, there's two paths here, and we'll probably walk down both to some extent. Is one, developers are customers that we have an obligation to serve, and if they want to be served here, we have to find a way to accommodate them, and we have the CSER process. But when it comes to rate basing, we particularly with the mindset of hitting these clean energy goals that are all of our obligations, we do see that there's a role for the utility, and really this is our role as the DSP or DSO, is directing some of that traffic, right? Saying here is the most efficient place for society to have distributed solar, and for that reason we're willing to rate base portions or all of it, and we encourage developers to build here. And
yeah, it's not all that different than the
NISO
NISO process. When it comes to the NISO's planning, it's a similar thing.
I think so. Just to interject one second, I think the only difference is, and I highlighted this in the original distribution planning, is that sometimes the solutions on the distribution side are much more nimble than the solutions on the transmission and especially bulk transmission side. Meaning that you might be able to see, based on a forecast scenario, that there's issues in an area, but you can also wait until you're a lot closer to see how those issues manifest before pulling the trigger on a solution. So it does, in some ways, make distribution planning a little different, and you're not necessarily going to pull the trigger on projects until you really know that you need them, especially when something as speculative as what the future DER development might be in a particular area.
Yeah, this is Ed from the CEB. Not to contradict the concept that the distribution system can be more nimble, which I completely agree with. I do, though, just want to interject one thing that is too often not considered in these conversations, which is that there are other stakeholders who also have very strong opinions as to where things should and should not be built. This goes back to the need for really truly integrated resource planning, and that integrated resource planning process to be as inclusive as possible, because what we often see in other jurisdictions, the environmental community will come to industry and say, hey, this is where you should build stuff because of our priorities and our analysis. The utilities will come to industry and say, hey, this is where you should build things because of our priorities and our analysis. And what we need to do is bridge the gap and make sure that everybody is a part of the conversation, because we don't want to have situations where we think we've solved it between the people on this call, and then the environmental community says, absolutely not, you can't possibly build in that area.
So this is Jason. Obviously, time check. It's 11:59. We had this scheduled till noon. I guess I'm looking at, obviously good discussion, especially in this discussion in the last, 15, 20 minutes, really focusing on the planning aspect of things. So I think this has been great. Looking for thoughts as far as, next steps, do we need to continue this discussion? And what's the best, process and effort for that? Do we ask the JU to, respond to some of the to some of the topics and thoughts and comments that were provided today, and go from there, or whatnot? I'm just kind of looking for input as far as next steps.
Yeah, Jason, this is Zach with NICEA. I think that's a reasonable next step.
Well, this is Kat, and I don't know if I'm putting the utilities on the spot, but back to the kind of question on, the statutory obligation that Liz highlighted. Are the utilities prepared at this point to come back and talk to this group about your thoughts about designing a process to do just that? Revise your existing distribution planning process to meet the CLCPA mandate, or are we too early there?
I mean, I think we could. Jared mentioned this earlier, right? When you say distribution planning, I think we're talking about a slice, a big slice, but a slice of distribution planning, maybe focused around integration of generation and how it affects the rest of the process. But I think yes, and maybe with some focus around potentially the cost share 2.0 policy as a jumping off point, considering that allows us to do something now, right? We don't need new policy. We can start working with that and developing process around it.
Hey, that's definitely true, and I really, it's Liz. I really appreciate the kudos for cost sharing 2.0, but I do want to just footnote or caveat that the commission can't decide to spend ratepayer dollars on system upgrades until there's a plan that shows the commission where they're needed. So I think you saw in cost sharing 2.0, some signs of willingness of the commission to, to make investment in distribution upgrades, and, effective planning to identify where those upgrades are currently or will probably be needed in the future, is kind of a prerequisite to the commission, deciding how to spend ratepayer dollars in the future.
So it sounds like we probably would need an additional meeting to do a little bit of follow-up on today's discussion. and it would probably be focused more on some responses from the JU on the discussions today. And I guess, from the JU standpoint, what kind of time frame do you think you would need before we would set up a follow-up discussion?
I think it depends on what the ask is. If it's just to come back and continue to have this conversation, I think a lot of the folks on the phone have some of that expertise. A lot of distribution planners on the call can speak through the details if that's what we want to get into. I think if we were to speak to specifics, maybe, starting with something like how to use MVD, right, just as a jumping off point. In a couple of weeks, we might be prepared to speak to, at least here at Grid. I know it's conversations we're having internally.
Any other thoughts?
I kind of agree. If it's just a discussion based on continuation here, it could be relatively quickly. If you want us to kind of take back and brainstorm a bit on potential methods for planning for DER and hosting capacity and meeting the needs of the CLCPA related to DER, we might need to, I would say, go back and prepare a bit and brainstorm amongst the utilities to do such a presentation.
John, I think that this is Bill. I think that would be valuable. So you guys are going to be proposing some things and modifications going forward, and so having you collect your thoughts and then having the discussion might be the most valuable.
So I guess, I don't want to, I'm trying to be considerate of people's time and everything. From the JU side, John or Tom, would you guys, take the lead as far as talking amongst the JU, is, going along those lines of what you had mentioned, the latter discussion, putting some thoughts into a presentation for discussion, how much time you would need, and when possible, a good time frame for getting back together with the group would be. I'd be interested in that. Does that seem to work for the group?
Yeah, it looks like a lot of us might be on IPWG, so maybe we could find a integrated planning. Maybe we talk on integrated planning and come back. John, I don't know if you have another forum to talk through, but I from our standpoint, we could come prepared to speak to some of how we're looking at MVD planning and forecasting and things like that in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll put it on the JU, and I'll reach out to Tom and John and the rest of the JU representatives to put together a time frame, and then I'll circle back with the rest of the group and try to get another call like this scheduled to further talk. I know summertime's coming and schedules are going to be tight, so it might be a little bit difficult, but it'd probably still be a virtual meeting like this via WebEx. So hopefully that works for everybody. That sound like a good next step?
Works for us.
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
That's good, Jason. Thank you.
I think, overall, I want to thank Mark again for his presentation beginning. I think it was a great, there's a lot of good information there and a good discussion. Thanks everyone for participating today, and we'll be circling back and getting out more information on a second meeting with this group.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.